Welcome, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Be Prepared, Not Too Scared, How Sociology Graduate Students Can Slay the Conference Thing. My name is Awish Aslam, and I'm the Chair and Central Rep for the CSA Student Concern Subcommittee. Our committee also includes our Eastern Rep, Emma Kay, and our Western Rep, Nicole Millette.
Hello, everyone.
We'd like to thank the Canadian Sociological Association for sponsoring this initiative and Sherry Fox, the Executive Director for the CSA, for working with us to plan and organize this series. Today's guest speaker is Dr. Mervyn Horgan, an Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the University of Guelph. Mervyn is active in a number of professional organizations. He's the Communications Officer for the Canadian Sociological Association. He's on the board for the Sociological Theory Research Committee of the International Sociological Association, and he is a co-founder of the Canadian Network for Critical Sociology. Thank you very much for joining us today, Mervyn.
Thank you.
Before we begin, I'd like to let audience members know that if you do have any questions during the webinar, you can submit those using the Q&A function, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. Your questions will be visible to all attendees and panelists, and audience members may also like questions to prioritize them. Mervyn will address those questions during the Q&A period following his presentation. Now, I will turn the webinar over to Mervyn.
Okay, hi there everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. So I'd like to begin, as is thankfully becoming customary in Canada, by acknowledging my presence in Guelph, in the city of Guelph, on Dish with One Spoon territory, the treaty lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Between the Lakes Purchased Three Lands. And in Canada more generally, I want to acknowledge that we're all on traditional unceded and or territory lands of First Nations, Inuit and Métis people. Even though we're all embodied beings, enmeshed in all sorts of connections with other human and non-human animals, and we're sort of now in this weird kind of interaction, which is not a kind of interaction that I personally am used to. I'm somebody who's interested in what happens when human beings are in the same place at the same time. I'm interested in co-presence. So a webinar kind of strips away some of that, but not all of it. So I'm grateful that we're sharing this embodied space, but also this virtual kind of space. So and before I kind of get into the sort of webinar proper, I'd like to thank the Students Concern Subcommittee for this initiative, to Awish Islam, Emma Kay and Nicole Millette. It's brilliant to see grad students working collaboratively to advance our kind of the collective interests of sociologists in Canada. And this sort of initiative with the webinars around thinking about training and professionalization into the discipline is really important. And it's a fantastic addition to the range of initiatives that the CSA has undertaken in the last few years. I also want to give a shout out to the Student Concern Subcommittee for the really great statement that they brought to the executive of the Canadian Sociological Association a number of weeks ago around support for graduate students during the pandemic. It was a really good statement. It was clear and precise, and I think the sort of online bubbling around it has been great to see that it's become a sort of a model for other disciplines, organizations and institutions across the country and internationally to follow. So kudos to the Student Concern Subcommittee. And then finally, before I start, I'd like to give a huge thanks to the CSA's Executive Director, Sherry Fox, whose work on behalf of the CSA has really advanced not just the association, but also the discipline in Canada. I've served on the exec of the CSA in two different capacities over the last 10 years. And you know, literally every day I'm kind of blown away by the depth and range of Sherry's capacities to kind of help us to organize things and to keep things on track for people. So special thanks to Sherry as well. Okay, sorry, I realize I should have been advancing slides there while Awish was doing her thing, was doing her introduction, so I apologize for that. So there's the slides that were prepared in advance, and there's me. So, and Awish has already outlined how you can interact if you have questions. Okay. I promise I'll be more on top of things from here on in. Okay, so here's a basic overview. I'm going to start by talking about the conference puzzle a little bit, or a couple of puzzles about conferences. I'll talk about, generally when we talk about conferences, the primary concern that people have are their presentations. But I kind of want to change our thinking about that just a little bit. So I'll talk about some ways we might think about conferences, the variety of conference experiences that we might have, a kind of a typology of conferences, a continuum. And I'd like to think of, maybe start us by, in a couple of minutes, just by thinking about conference presentations as a genre. Then we get to the core elements of the conference experience. Like I said, we tend to think of presenting our work as the primary function of conferences, but really there's a lot happening at conferences. And in general, presenting our work is a tiny proportion of our time at conferences. So attending presentations is probably the primary thing. Other sorts of formal involvements, which I'll touch on very, very briefly. And then we'll talk in closing sort of about some informal elements of the conference experience. And then I'll give some general pointers, but the real core of the presentation will be those 4 points about attending presentations, presenting, and informal elements really is what we'll focus on. Okay, so before we do that though, Sherry has created a little poll just to get a little sense of some of our participants' experiences so far. So I'll give you 30 seconds to submit your answer to that poll. It just basically asks, have you ever attended a conference? Have you ever presented? And if so, how did it go? Okay, great. So we have everyone's been to one, or everyone who's responded. All of our respondents have been to a conference. Many of you have presented, some of you haven't, that's good. And the mays have it on the experience of going to conferences with one person. Ugh. So plenty of good experiences or great experiences, but as they often go, conferences are strange sorts of beasts. Okay, so we'll get into the kind of bones of the presentation. So so the conference puzzle. So one kind of part of the puzzle is that, conferences are sort of characterized by some kind of fundamental tensions at their heart. Okay, this is, sociologists like fundamental tensions at the heart of any phenomenon. So first, they're sort of essential to our work as a community of sociologists, but we're not obliged to attend. So it's something that's essential to us as researchers, but as individuals, we're not obliged to attend, right? The conference will go on whether or not you decide to show up. And maybe the more interesting one for us today is that conferences are simultaneously completely terrifying and really fun. They can be both of those things at the same time. There's no contradiction there. They can be terrifying and fun. Not quite like bungee jumping, but maybe. Okay. So the essential part of conferences is that we're a community of scholars come together to share and debate ideas, to learn about what our colleagues are doing. They sort of have a ritual dimension, right? There are formal parts, they can be solemn, they can be celebratory, but ultimately as sociologists, we gather because we have a shared belief in and a commitment to critiquing received wisdoms, to thinking together about alternative futures, and to advancing knowledge in the discipline more generally. Right, whether that's kind of straightforward sorts of scientific advancement and innovation, but sort of the kinds of reflexivity and critique that we're interested in sociology too. There's space for all of that sort of work in sociology. So I think the reasons why conferences are essential, but not obligatory, kind of feed into the reasons why they're both terrifying and fun as well. They're terrifying simply because they're where a community of scholars come together to share and debate ideas. We put ourselves into our ideas, we worry about how our work will be received, how others will respond to our work and our ideas. We're concerned they'll think less of us, right? That's generally, I think, a kind of a characteristic feeling at conferences. And this is a basic part of academic life, right? Is the sort of the fear of judgment, right? It's characteristic of life in general, but of academic life in particular, and the conference scene in very specifically. So I guess the thing to remember when we think about conferences as terrifying is that the vast majority of people who are at conferences are there to learn and to share ideas. Okay, there's various performative elements and things that we talk about, but really you're part of a community of scholars you're there with other people who have committed themselves professionally to being part of a community of scholars and to sharing ideas and research. So I like to keep that in mind when I'm terrified. And trust me, the terror does not go away. You just get better at maybe handling it, I think. Okay, so in a moment, I'm going to dig down into the elements, a little bit into the elements of the conference experience and on presentation in particular. But before we get to that, I'd like us to maybe think a little bit about some different ways that we might think about conferences in general, right? In general, so we could think about sort of varieties of conferences, right? So they vary massively. There are disciplinary differences, So for example, if you've ever been at a philosophy conference, even a philosophy talk, the sort of style at a philosophy conference is generally very combative, right? It's really about the sort of connection between the person and their ideas, and people really, really go at poking holes in arguments. In psychology, for example, it tends to be, many psychology conference tends to emulate the sort of natural sciences, right? And it's really about methodological rigor and about kind of very precise kinds of findings. In sociology, we're sort of we have many. We're sort of a big tent, if you like, sort of discipline, right? So there are big disciplinary differences in the style that kind of happens at conferences. There are also national and regional differences. So our national association in Canada, sociology, CSA annual meetings are very different in feel to the American Sociological Association, for example, which tends to have a really very highly professionalized kind of feel at the ASA, and it feels quite competitive. I think we have a sort of a more collegial sort of a vibe generally, my sense is, at least at the CSA. And then we can think, I haven't been to many different regional conferences, but say I've been to the Eastern Sociological Society in the US, which is a lot closer to the feel of the CSA, right? So there's sort of various kinds of differences by association as well. And then we could think about basic characteristics of conferences. Conferences that have more that are gender imbalanced in some way will generally have a different sort of a feel. If they're demographically, if there's a lot of older, very well established faculty, or if it's more heavily weighted towards junior faculty or graduate students, there'd be a very different sort of a feel at that conference. One of the big ones, I guess, is difference of scale, right? Giant conferences, big conferences, 5, 6, 7,000 person conferences, let's say like the ASA, American Sociological Association, or the International Sociology Association World Congress, but even our own CSA at times, because it's part of the wider Congress of the Humanities and Social Sciences, can sometimes feel impersonal. But often that can create kind of space for sorts of casual encounters and informal sociability that mightn't otherwise happen at smaller conferences. Smaller types of conferences, small scale conferences that are like a small working group kind of conferences can be great because you get a very strong sociable feel. There can be a great kind of a camaraderie sort of emerges at them. There can also be conflicts that emerge that taint the social elements of those sorts of conferences. And then a sort of a kind of an alien from the planet Zog watching a conference will be kind of amazed, I'm sure, to watch the differences in style and decorum that you find at conferences. How dressed up people are. I've noticed a sort of a creep of more formal attire at the CSA conference over the last decade, I think. At the American conference, you tend to see a lot of dicky bows on men, which you don't see as much of at CSA, for example, but little sort of differences like these that can be kind of instructive. So us getting a sense of these kind of variations can help us to figure out, just can help us to kind of attune to the sort of culture of the conference we're going to. A really oversimplified way of thinking about a typology of conferences, which can help you to think about your involvement and how you might think about pitching your work, is to think about kind of a generalist conference, big conferences that are for the discipline in general, CSA, ISA, like I've mentioned, ASA, British Sociological Association. We can think about more specialist conferences. So we have an element of that within our own association. We research clusters. Some people tend to just hang out within their research clusters and just go to papers within that. So it begins to get a feel of a specialist conference. Within the International Sociological Association, the research committees have have interim conferences in between the World Congress. So those tend to be much more specialist on theory or urban sociology, whatever your field might be. We could think about more hyper-specialized conferences, right? So we could, if there's a conference on the settlement experiences of Syrian refugees in Canada, right? That's a really specialized type of conference where there's going to be very specific kinds of expertise, and there'll be types of things that you probably do or don't need to say in your setup at more specialized conferences. Then we can think about more generally interdisciplinary conferences, and those vary like crazy. So these tend to be topic focused generally. So thinking about kind of what type of conference you're going to and where you're presenting can kind of help you think about what level of detail will be necessary, for example, in setting up your paper. If you're at a generalist conference, and it's just a general sort of a session on something or other, and you're talking about settler colonialism, for example, you might need to define that at an ASA conference, let's say, right? But at a conference at Decolonizing the University, you probably don't need to spend much time talking about what settler colonialism is, right? Unless you're dealing with a controversial type of a definition of that term, for example. Okay, then we could think about the conferences again in a different way, kind of a continuum between really highly professionalized conferences where people are, well dressed, where you submit a paper 6 months to a year in advance that's fully polished, that the paper you submit well in advance. So this would be the sort of ASA model, a very professional sort of model. Then we could think about more semi-formal, informal kind of conferences and everything in between. So at the level of informality, I'm thinking of, some graduate programs will have graduate conferences that tend to be often quite small. We have one at the University of Guelph, right? That's quite small, very friendly, collegial, sort of a supportive kind of environment, right? And then there's everything in between. But you can kind of help you to think about what sort of work you might want to submit or what stage work should be at. So at a highly professionalized conference that requires a full paper in advance, then that's going to be quite different than giving a paper at a conference, maybe where you're permitted or where there's a sort of a general feel that people are kind of thinking out loud or working through ideas. Okay. So none of these is better or more important than any of the others, I would say. They all have their place in the sort of ecology of our discipline and in developing and disseminating knowledge. Okay. Another way is to think about conference presentations in particular as a genre, right? So not all presentations of our research happen at conferences. Presentations of our research at conferences are a particular kind. So you can think about presentation as a genre. So there are lots of related kinds of genres: in-class presentations, job talks, my 6-year-old or my 6th grade child's project presentation for her class, public talks at your local library, 3-minute thesis kind of talks, right, which I'm not a huge fan of as a model, TEDx kind of talks, defenses, Senate committee hearings, presentations about presentations. They're a genre, right? Expert witness testimonials, job talks, etc. Right? They're all different sorts of genres that are related but are not precisely the same. They give us some sorts of principles that are useful for thinking about what a conference presentation is. So there's a mountain of material out there on presenting at conference, but I think at conferences, thinking about it as a genre is useful, right? Because genre is something that has conventions. So a convention is a recurring way of doing things in a very basic sort of a way that's sort of accepted within a field. If you want to have a quick chuckle that highlights conventions in scientific presentations, there's a famous presentation about a decade ago at the American Association of the Advancement of Science. If you go to YouTube and just Google, or I think it just works on YouTube. If you go to YouTube and search for chicken, there's a pretty funny 4-minute presentation that consists of one single word repeated over and over, and it plays with the idea of conventions. So genres have conventions. And part of what we need to do is learn some of the conventions, because that helps you to kind of fit in. But also what we know from work in the sociology of the arts, for example, on artistic conventions, is that by understanding conventions, we learn how to play with them, right? So it's by knowing the conventions of a genre that you can innovate within them and push at them and hopefully have a little bit of fun. Now, we could get all Bourdieusian here and discuss the relationship between your habitus and the field, your position in the field, and your ability to play with conventions. But this presentation is not in that kind of genre. Okay, so I won't do that. Okay, Okay, so what is it that we do at conferences? So there are 4 core elements of the conference experience, right? Or another way to think about that, the time that you spend at conferences is kind of split into 4 parts, consists of 4 things. You attend presentations, you present your work, and as I mentioned, presenting your work, proportionately takes up a massive amount of our mental energy, but takes very little of the actual time that we spend at a conference. And then we can think about other formal involvements that we would have at conferences. These would be things like research committee meetings, session organizing, session chairing, perhaps acting as a discussant, other kinds of formal involvements we might have as officers, etc. And then sort of informal socializing sorts of elements of the conference. So we tend to focus overwhelmingly, like I said, on presenting. That makes sense, because this is where each of us at our work are the focus of attention. It's where we're literally on stage. So we'll of course talk about that, but truth be told, our own presentations of our own research are far from the only place where the action is at conferences. Okay, so attending presentations, I'm going to deal with first. So attending presentations sort of is really instructive for a number of reasons, right? It's the single best way to learn how to become a better presenter. I would say, besides doing your own presentations, attending other presentations is the single best way to become a better presenter. So most obviously you attend presentations to learn about new research in your field, in the discipline generally, but you also learn a sort of hidden curriculum, right? That sociologists of education have identified the hidden curriculum, the things you learn that aren't actually being explicitly stated, right? So you learn about the generalized expectations of that conference, of presentations in a discipline or in a subfield. Okay, so this, sorry. Okay. So it's not just about, when you're attending presentations, it's not necessarily just about the content, right? You learn about different styles of presenting, you see what works, what doesn't work. How do people open talks? I really like thinking about how you open a talk, right? How you open a paper when you're writing a paper. How do people open? How do presenters hook an audience in? How do they get you interested, right? I like a colleague of mine, Jesse Carlson, a sociologist in Nova Scotia, talks about openings as kind of clearings of the throat, right? How do people make it evident that they're about to begin something? So when you're attending presentations, you're learning content, but you're also learning about style, strategy, things that work and things that don't. So I would say kind of an important part of attending presentations is that you give presenters your attention. It's important, right? Adopt the golden rule. Treat others like you'd like to be treated. This, I think, is especially the case in presentations that are poorly attended, which, truth be told, are often the places where you have the most interesting kinds of conversations, because they tend to become a little looser and more informal. But I think it's important to give people your attention, right? As you might expect them to give you their attention. But I guess a way in, if you're particularly anxious about presenting yourself, is I would absolutely encourage people to ask questions at presentations, right? Asking questions. That's an important part of attending presentations, is sort of being part of the actual dialogue that's happening in that space. So I, have been to many conferences. My heart still races in my chest when I begin thinking about asking a question. I wonder to myself if I'm going to blush as I speak, especially if I'm thinking of a question that might be may challenge something about what the speaker says, or if there's a lot of other people in the room, or if it's the presenter is a prominent scholar, but it's something I really want to ask, right? Very basic sorts of elements of being courteous around asking a question. There's a nice piece put together a few years ago by Jim Connolly and Mark Stoddart that's on the CSA website, A Modest Proposal, it's called, for being part of something. It's a modest proposal. If you search it on the CSA website, you'll find it. Stand if you can, say your name. Those are sort of very basic things, but that are worth stating, I think. Make sure that the presenter you're addressing can actually see you, and preferably that the audience can see you. If there's a mic, use it. That's a basic issue of accessibility, and often a mic is present because there may be a recording made of bigger keynote talks, etc. And then in terms of asking questions, it's a good way into helping you with nerves a little bit too, I think. But it's about asking. It's important to ask somebody about what they've done rather than what they haven't done. Right? It's a lot more interesting and a lot fairer to ask somebody about what they've done. Deal with the presentation on the terms that the presenter has set rather than on your own agenda. Right? So we want to kind of have that sort of generosity in our thinking with others, right? That's so asking somebody to think to think with you, sort of, right? But I would say also, if you're too nervous to ask a question, or if you prefer to chat informally, by all means, hang around afterwards, right? Approach the presenter. Sometimes you'll see big lineups for talks. Usually, say at CSA sessions, research cluster sessions, there's an opportunity afterwards to chat informally with presenters. If you're genuinely interested in someone's work, they'll more often than not be interested in what you have to say. Especially for student presentations, right? This is certainly the case, I think. And everyone is nervous, right? Everyone appreciates when their work is taken seriously and when other scholars engage with it. So one other point I would say about attending presentations, which is not on the PowerPoint, but I would say if you're at a conference, by all means go to the talks in your area, the talks you want to see, but also get yourself out of your comfort zone. Listen to what people across the place are saying. Go to something in a different research cluster, or in an area that you maybe know a little bit about, or don't know very much about, but have some vague sort of interest in. There's a sort of a sharing of knowledge, and it can kind of trigger ideas for yourself. And you learn different styles just by, if I go to a conference, I'll generally try to attend one session that's sort of out of my zone or my area in some way. Because you learn a lot, right? It drives your thinking in new sorts of directions. Okay. I've mentioned approaching the presenters. Okay, presenting our work. Okay, and this is where I'm going to focus for a little bit. So this is going to take me a little bit of time to get through this. So preparing and presenting our work. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is that presenting is drag. Here's a basic structure. Presenting is drag, whether or not you should script, using your time, use of slides, a basic structure, a tentative structure that I would not say is written in stone, just a basic idea for a structure of a research talk. Thinking a little bit about openings and closings, and the thing that we sometimes dread, where our hearts beat the most when we present, is dealing with questioners. Okay, so presenting, you might think presenting is a drag. I'm going to say that presenting is drag. Okay, Judith Butler is right, Goffman is right. Social life is performance. All right, you're sociologists, we know that. Right, presenting at a conference is very explicitly performative. Right, the best presenters seem natural, and I'm putting natural in inverted commas. Okay, a good presenter seems natural because good presenters are those who play at, perform, who do drag of good presenter. Okay, so it's an explicitly performative environment. Okay, all social life is performance, but this is where you are actually explicitly performing. Okay, so you don't need to apologize for that. It's difficult to feel natural, for it to feel natural, and that's because it is a staged performance. Okay, and that's okay. A natural performance is one that looks where somebody performs being natural, I think, right? But again, we're not going to dig down too deep into the layers of interaction and theories of performance in there. Okay, so scripting, to script or not to script. If it's a big presentation, and me personally, if I'm exceptionally nervous, I will script the whole thing, every word, every single word, the jokes, the pauses, the slides, whatever it is. If I'm trying to be funny, I'll insert jokes. But I was at a conference as a graduate student many years ago in the US, and it was one of these where there was going to be speeches while people ate. There was going to be presentations while people had dinner, and I ended up sitting next to a person who at the time, I didn't know them, but they were a prominent literary scholar who was giving a paper sort of as a sort of a pre-banquet kind of paper. So we chatted for a bit, and then they asked me for a couple of minutes to look over the paper. This was a scholar who was in their 70s. So out of the corner of my eye, I'm sitting next to this scholar, and I see them make small edits to their paper, a fully printed script of their paper, insert pauses into their opening lines. This is somebody who clearly done hundreds, if not thousands, of formal presentations. I watched as they edited the opening lines and inserted a little comment about something somebody had said in a previous paper, in a previous session. I watched them stick in a little pun, and I saw them shaking. Right, this is a well-established, prominent scholar, and then they got up and they nailed the presentation. Right, they barely looked at their notes, but just occasionally looked down, clearly using the script as a prompt to help them stay on track. So if you have a script, it means you're really close to the material. So scripts help with nerves because it means you have something to lean on if necessary. It also forces you to practice, and having a script, the act of writing it out forces good editing, and it really aids in memory. So often if I have a script for something, I'll find that I actually don't end up referring to it too much. But if I lose my train of thought or I get flustered a little bit, I know I have it to lean on, all right? So even if you have a script, you'll often find, because you've sort of crafted it a little bit, that you actually end up being able to kind of riff freely a little bit as you relax a little bit. It helps you to relax a little bit. You don't need to use one. I find them useful. I'm getting better at not using them now. But I have a script right here for this presentation, for example. Okay, so scripts. Time. Golden rule here is never, ever, ever go over. Okay, and I'm probably going to break that rule myself here, but this is a slightly different because I have a captive audience and there's only one paper. But never, ever, ever go over. The key here is to obviously have practiced, right, and to have a sense of how long it's going to take. But be ready to cut to the chase if necessary. If you're told you have 2 minutes left, where are you going to go in that paper? Where you're going to get right to your findings or to your sort of your culmination, right? You want to be able to cut to that quickly if necessary. It's very easy to run out of time, especially when we're nervous, right? Presentations go very, very quickly. So if the chair, you can ask the chair of a session to give you time prompts, right? Often chairs will give you like kind of a 5 minute, a 1 minute, and a cut it kind of prompt. But you can ask for a couple more if you want. Can you let me know when I've got 10 minutes left, right? If you have sort of flagged that, if that helps you to sort of stay on track. But again, never, ever, ever go over. That's really just as a courtesy to your co-presenters too, and to give the audience time to ask questions. Okay, slides. I'm a fan of less is more on slides. Slides are very, very useful, but they can also kind of force us into very linear sorts of ways of thinking and of organizing our arguments, which doesn't work for all sorts of arguments that we might want to make. Big text and clear images are important. So your audience, generally for slides and for speaking, is the person at the back of the room. Can they see? If you've got a table and it's got really tiny text in it, and the person at the back of the room can't see it, you're going to lose. It's going to be hard for people to engage with the material. Okay, so think about the person at the back of the room as the audience for your voice and for your visuals. If you're using a lot of visuals, if your slides tell the whole story on their own, there might be just too much going on in those slides, right? We want to be able to hear a little bit about what you have to say. And then something that people do, particularly if they're doing papers that have a lot of stats and tables in them, it can be useful to have slides in reserve that you don't actually use. But that if a question comes up, you say, oh yes, well I did actually run that by gender, right? And you can pull that up as a slide that you have handy, just that you didn't get a chance to talk about, but that you can bring it up if it's a question that you might be able to anticipate, around more detailed data that folks may wish to dig down into a little bit. Okay, basic structure. I'm calling this a basic structure, not the basic structure, right? There's no magic formula. The weighting here might be instructive. Okay, think about the weighting in a presentation between sort of exposition, demonstration, findings. So the sort of a good way to start is to begin with an opening puzzle or attention. Okay, a contradiction, a startling stat, or an interesting statistic. It doesn't have to be a big attention grabber, right? It could be something really banal like, hey, conferences are fun and terrifying at the same time. Okay, that's a kind of a banal statement, but it's a little bit of a tension, it's a puzzle. Why are they both? Why is a conference both of those things, right? That's an easy sort of a hook, kind of a lame one, but these kinds of connections can be appreciated by audiences, I think, and they help to sort of set the scene a little bit. Then you spend a couple of minutes on scene setting. So I'm not even going to give lit review its own heading in the basic structure of a talk, right? Presenters in sociology and many disciplines often lean really, really heavily on lit reviews, right? But lit reviews can be done really quickly. Your paper proper, the paper you publish, right? The dissertation chapter can have an amazing lit review. But lit reviews generally are not especially interesting for people in the audience, right? The lit review is a way for you. We're more interested in what you have to say than what other people have said about the thing that you're talking about, right? So use your lit review, existing literature, to give a brief background and justification for your study, right? Don't waste 12 out of 15 minutes on what somebody else has said, right? The audience is here for what you have to say. And spend a minute on your research question, maybe less. Right, that get us to your design and methods quite quickly. You'll see these are all very short amount of time that we're spending on this, because we're saving our time for getting to the stuff that we're kind of here for, findings, the actual things that are novel, that are interesting about your study in particular, okay? So you obviously can't present everything. Let's say you've done 50 interviews and you've got 8 amazing themes from your interviews. You can't reasonably tell us about all 8 of those themes without ramming through them, right? Without rushing through them. So what about the 3 that were most exciting, or that challenge existing literature, or that really piqued your interest, right? Or that people really seemed to focus on, right? In your interviews, for example, okay? And then you can link back to your opening puzzle to close, right? The implications, new directions, other possibilities, what you'd like to do with this next, right? Are you challenging, confirming, nuancing existing research? What are new places that this can take us, okay? So that's a basic idea for structure. There are many different kinds of advice around how to structure a talk, but I think a key one for grad students in particular is not to spend too much time on the lit review if you have some research done, okay? Lit reviews are interesting and important, but for conference presentations, it's good for us to learn about what your actual research is going to do, is doing, or is going to do, or has done. Okay, so I think it's important to think about openings and closings. Really, most important thing I would say about openings, besides the kind of posing a puzzle paradox, which is a useful kind of a way to start, right, or a contradiction of some kind, do not start a presentation with "I'm sorry for being unprepared." Right, it's okay to say you're nervous, that's fine, but don't apologize for the fact that you're present and that you're unprepared, or right, that this is don't apologize that this is an exploratory study. You don't need to apologize for that. You just tell us that that's the case. It's fine, okay? And then in terms of closings, the conclusion of a paper doesn't have to be earth-shattering, right? We tend not to make earth-shattering findings in sociology, okay? A lot of what we do is nuance, finesse existing knowledge. So I think the thing to aim for is clarity and precision in your conclusions, in your closings, right? Clarity and precision, okay? So no apologies, that's important. Don't apologize for your work, right? You can apologize for being nervous, but not for your work. Okay, questions and questioners. Okay, express thanks to your questioners. If you bullshit an answer, people can smell it. If you don't know the answer to something, or you're really challenged by something, it's okay to say, you know, that's something I haven't thought about, or something I'll have to think about. I'm not familiar with that paper you mentioned. That's clearly something I need to read. Those are all perfectly legitimate sorts of answers. If you don't know, if you don't have an answer to give, that's okay, right? It's a difficult spot to think on your feet. One thing that we often are concerned about with questions is it's not necessarily the question that's asked, but the demeanor or the tone of the question asker that can throw us, right? Sometimes it's not actually the question, it's the way it's asked that can kind of throw us. So I would say generally don't interrupt a questioner unless they're droning on, and then in that case you could sort of appeal to the chair and ask the chair to intervene, okay? Questions that are unkind or ungenerous, I think you can be snubbed. Right, snub is a very powerful thing in social interaction. Aggressive lines of questioning don't really need to be tolerated, right? If you really need to, you can slip a note to the chair saying, you know, can you move us on from this, right? Or it's good for you to say, look, it's good. This is clearly something you're very passionate about. It's good that we move on, hear other voices, share thoughts of other presenters, hear from other people in the audience. That's a perfectly okay thing to say. And you'll find that often you will have many allies in the room who are thinking similar sorts of things if somebody is sort of being particularly aggressive or unkind in their questioning. Okay, I don't think I put this on a slide, sorry. And then one thing about questions is when you present, don't don't present and then leave immediately, I think is a good, generally, is hang around, even if it goes badly, hang around. Sometimes people want to ask a question, or they're nervous, or somebody else hogs all the time, somebody asks a long-winded question and somebody gives a long-winded answer, and people don't get to ask the questions they had. So it's good to hang around afterwards, right? The chair might miss a hand that went up during the question time for somebody who was about to ask the question of you that you have been wondering about yourself and would really like to talk about with them. As a grad student, I presented at a conference and I hung around afterwards, and I had a retired scholar came up to me afterwards, and I had quoted her work, I referenced her work in the paper, and we got chatting, and we chatted a bit, and then eventually this ended up within a year, had ended up into us doing a little research project together and publishing a paper, basically because I had referenced her work in my paper, and then I had hung around after the paper, shuffling my bits and pieces of paper, and we ended up having a chat. So it's worth hanging around afterwards. Okay. Other considerations that you might want to think about a little bit are sort of basic day of sort of things. Arrive early, get your props in order, get your slides in order. If you're presenting from an iPad or from paper, make sure it's in big font that you can see it. Check your tech twice. Make sure that your slides are working. Bring some water, bring some mints. Which is what I like to do at least. As I mentioned, who are you addressing? Think about the person at the back of the room as your audience. Okay, if you address a conversation, if you address to the person at the back of the room, you are more likely to maintain the interest and attention of everyone between you and the people at the back of the room, right? Whereas if you just address it to the people in the very front row, it tends to. This is similar for teaching in big classes, for example. You tend to lose people closer to them who are more further back. Making eye contact, things like that. Some people like to scan a room. Some people do patterned sort of movements around a room to try and keep themselves on track. Having friends in the room is good. A friend who nods at everything you say when you catch their eye, that can be great, I find. Okay. One thing that people sometimes think about is the perils of humor. Conferences often have a sort of a stodgy or formal feel. So small jokes and puns can kind of be relatively easy, but they can also be received in a variety of sorts of ways, right? We often deal with serious topics, and there may be an element of judgment to our use of humor. It tends to be easier for more senior scholars to use humor, for example. But see how other people use humor and see if it works, right? And I guess finally, other consideration as a presenter, thinking about nerves, right? I like to think about being nervous means that I care, right? The fact that I'm nervous about a presentation means that I care because I'm putting myself out there, but also I get nervous because I have I respect the judgment and the ideas and the feelings of my peers and of my colleagues, and I'm interested in what they think of what I have to say, right? So my nerves are sort of a reflection of my kind of personal investment and my interest in the field. So I have done, more than 50 presentations. Every single time I get, vomitously nervous, right? Even including this kind of weird webinar sort of one, right? My stomach is at me, my pulse races, the devil on my shoulder is telling me that I'm useless, that this is nonsense. And this is before I even get to the room where I'm presenting, right? So we're all nervous, right? We probably just wear it differently. So being nervous means that we care about what we're saying, we respect those that we're speaking to, we care about our ideas and our research. So, being nervous means that you care. I don't think there's a way to get rid of them. The best way is to harness them and by preparing. Right? Being over-prepared is never really a problem. Right? Being underprepared is where the problem is. So being underprepared leads to an extra terrifying, nervous lead up and a scramble the night before, the day of, and afterwards almost always a feeling that it went badly. Right. Ultimately, though, a presentation is really short. Right. If it's 20 minutes, it's short. Right. So if it goes well, time will fly. If it doesn't go well, time will also fly. Right. Many people will attend 10, 15, 20 presentations at a conference. So if it doesn't go well, you won't be remembered forever. Right. People will forget about it quickly enough. And people are generally generous. Right. I would say. Okay. So if there are questions about some parts of that, I'm happy to sort of answer those or to try and answer those afterwards. So On to the kind of third part of the elements of the conference experience. Other formal involvements can be things like organizer, chair, discussant, going to formal meetings. Those are all sorts of avenues for you to explore, and places where you can kind of experiences you can have that kind of help you to kind of to hone your craft and to meet others with similar interests. Okay, so kind of want to rush a little bit to the more informal parts, I guess, right? So there are many kind of bits of this. Not a huge fan of the word networking, but we have kind of formal opportunities for networking, semi-formal. So in the CSA, we have the sort of, I can't remember the technical term we've used for it, sort of speed dating kind of model of moving around, where graduate students get to meet faculty, which was a good success at our last conference. There are many sorts of kind of semi-formal opportunities like that, like research cluster meetings and things like that, that often become kind of informal afterwards. And then there's very informal things like at the Congress, this sort of the beer tent, or there are sort of events, the book fair, where you're kind of wandering around and you randomly can bump into people. I would say one thing that people are sometimes more concerned about is that they really want to talk to a senior scholar in their field, for example. I would say it's perfectly legitimate before a conference to email somebody who's prominent in your field or whose work you've read and say, hey, look, I see that you're presenting at the CSA, let's say. I'm really interested in the work that you've published on whatever it is that you're interested in. It'd be great to have an opportunity to sit down and chat with you a little bit more. My work is on this, right? People are generally delighted to know that folks are reading their work and are taking it seriously and are thinking about it. So cold calls in advance are good, right? Those are fine. It's okay to reach out to people. And the worst that happens is they ignore you, or they say, sorry, I'm really busy, right? That's a big deal, right? Better to ask than not, I think. Think about senior colleagues, whether they're people in your department, faculty members, advisory committee members, peers in your program, or who you know across the country or in the discipline, as people who can help you who can be who can mediate introductions, right? Who can introduce you to scholars or other people you might be interested in, right? So ask your advisor, oh, hey, I see you were in graduate school with XYZ scholar. Is there any chance you could introduce us, right? You can, that's a way, it often makes it a little bit easier than a straight cold call, if you like. And then a part I think that's very important, and part of the conference experience that's probably besides presenting, that's most anxiety provoking, is the sort of kind of standing around and feeling really awkward, right? And that's, especially if you don't know very many people. So if you are in a circle of people chatting, you don't lose by expanding your circle and including the person who's hovering on the edge and seems kind of nervous, right? You don't generally lose by expanding your circles and generating more interactions and having more expansive kinds of conversations with a wider range of people, right? I think that's generally a positive thing, right? There can be negative elements to it, but I think it's better to try and bring people in, right, than to actively exclude people. And then I think the most important is the food. If there's food somewhere, follow it. If there's free food in particular, go where that is, because that's where there's going to be lots of people. And the existence of free food gives you small talk initially. Oh, hey, the spinach pies are really good, whatever it is, right? It gives you sort of an in, and those sort of informal little bits, right? I mean, so the most active spot at our conference generally is when there's, when one of the publishers sponsors coffee and cookies at the registration desk where Sherry, the executive director, is sitting, right? You'll end up having random conversations with people there, right? Or you might meet somebody you haven't met in a while and you're like, oh, I haven't seen you in ages, what are you doing? So follow the food, very good, important part of the conference experience, I would say. I still do it, right? Okay. Some other general pointers. I can't remember who talked about this one, and I've made this error myself, and I learned always assume when you're talking to someone that they're a faculty member. If the person's a graduate student, they'll be flattered. But if they're a faculty member and you mistake them for a graduate student, not that that's insulting, right? They might like that, but generally, if you assume that somebody is a faculty member, that's an okay mistake to make, right? I think. Okay, expanding circles I mentioned, and then I guess one kind of thing I'd like to kind of close on, I guess, is thinking about involvements at conferences and in professional life more generally as an academic, if you orient to your fellow grad students, your colleagues and your peers as competitors, you will generally drive yourself up the walls. You never lose by being collegial, right? You never lose by having a sort of a collaborative ethos, I think, right? Asking pointed questions is great, but going after somebody for the sake of going after somebody and questioning, for example, is just kind of petty, right? If you already orient your peers in purely competitive terms, then it's kind of hard to have fun, I think, right? It makes it a really anxiety-provoking sort of an experience. So obviously we have to be kind of instrumentally rational, right? People are trying to develop careers and things, but that doesn't mean that we have to let the logic of a competitive logic kind of rule what's happening, right? We're not in a zero-sum some game when it comes to advancing knowledge and thinking about our discipline, right? And thinking about scholarship. Our scholarly community is just that, right? It's a community of scholars, and I think having a sort of an ethos of mutual support within that and collegiality helps us all to sort of to rise in some sort of way. Okay. And then, thinking about that is something else I would say is don't waste your time on people who treat you poorly at conferences. If somebody is kind of rude or snubs you, well, that sucks, but that's okay. Don't waste your time. You can have formal scholarly interactions with people on email, in journals, at formal presentations. But in terms of the informal networking, social parts of conferences don't stand for the sort of poor treatment, I think. Okay. So key takeaways: prepare. I like scripting. You don't have to, but prepare. Prepare for presenting. Be generous in your participation by attending others and being generous in your questions and in your engagements with other presentations. And remember that ultimately we're here to learn about one another's work. So hopefully we can have some fun doing that. And if all else fails, if all else fails, play conference bingo. This is American sociologist has, for a number of years at the ASA, generated conference bingo sheets that you can play with that are sometimes a little bit cruel and sometimes a little bit funny, but you can have some fun with that. Okay, I'm more than happy to take any questions that you might have. So I think you're going to...
Thank you. Thanks for that really, really helpful presentation, Mervyn. I
apologize for breaking my own rule about going over time, but
Are you okay to stick around a few minutes?
Absolutely.
Okay. Perfect. All right, so I'm just gonna read out the questions that we received from audience members. So first, due to our limited funding opportunities as grad students, there are only so many conferences we can attend. Would it be more beneficial for us to present at larger scale conferences or smaller specialized conferences?
That's a great question. So funding is obviously the big issue always. So I know that students in very competitive programs at the bigger schools in Canada, for example, will be told, go to the ASA. That's the only one that counts, right? And that's a particular sort of an orientation to the discipline, I think, that I personally don't agree with. Lots of interesting things happen at the ASA, but I think there's often a sort of an inward-facing kind of a very clubbish sort of a feel to the really professionalized kind of conferences. But it is an amazing experience because it's so big and it is so professional. It's, if forced to choose, I guess it probably depends in part on where you're at with your research. If there's a specialist conference coming up that you kind of, oh my goodness, this is like the top 3 scholars in the keynote in my field or the keynote at this, and I've got my results chapter written, right, and I'm ready to present good work on this, then that's probably a really good idea for you to hit that conference, right? There are kind of pockets of funding that you can kind of, obviously funding is limited, but there are pockets of funding you can try and tap. But it's not something you can make a call on right away, right? That you should go to this one or that one. I think the CSA is generally, like, I went as a graduate student, started going as a graduate student, and have been going pretty consistently since. And in that 15-year period, let's say, or so, a little bit more, I have seen it become much more professional, but also kind of friendlier, more collegial. I think that's partly because I've gotten to know more people, maybe. But I think it's always a good place to get a sense of what's happening in the discipline in the country, in Canada, for example, and who's doing work on what. And even if the person isn't, if people aren't presenting, you get to hear people refer to studies by other people that are on topic in Canadian work, or Canadian scholars at Canadian schools, for example. So I can't kind of give a definitive answer to that question. I like big conferences, can be really interesting and terrifying. But also those specialist conferences, if they're really on point for you, are a really good thing as a grad student, because you get to meet people who are doing exactly the type of work you're doing, and they can really help you to develop that sort of smaller network of people who are right on topic. Sorry, that's kind of a fudgy answer, right?
No, that's great. It provides the context for planning it out. Thank you. So the next question: at conferences, it is not uncommon for grad students to be on a panel / in a session with more well-known researchers. How do you suggest we try to situate ourselves with more big-name scholars in our field and not be too intimidated?
That's a great question. Great question. It's terrifying, isn't it? If that happens, if you're lucky enough, I guess, right? If you're on a session with a well-known researcher and you're kind of a new entrant to a field, and there's somebody who's well established and well known and highly cited, whatever it is in that field, that is terrifying. I mean, I think that's part of being acknowledging your nerves is totally fine, and acknowledging it's great to be on a panel with somebody like X person who is so prominent in the field, right? So I guess the thing to remember is, so it can be intimidating and nerve-wracking to be in that sort of situation, but you also think about it as it's an opportunity to expose a top scholar in your field, right, a well-known researcher, to your work, right? So that's a fantastic opportunity, right? So that's a sort of a motivation, I would say, to be very well prepared, right? And also because we're a community of scholars, but that means we also what that means, being as a community of scholars, means that we also challenge one another and we ask people for clarification and things, right? So if you have something to say about that some person's work, right, that's might be an interesting, you don't kind of go for the person, right, but for their work. If you have something to say, or you notice the work you're doing is critiquing their work, or is going beyond it, or is kind of revisiting a question that they've left behind and assumed has been answered, talking about those kind of things can be useful, right? You earn respect by engaging in dialogue with people in your field, right? That's a respectable, it's like respect in the positive sense, right? That's a good thing, I think, right? But I would say, like, the basic rule of preparing, I would script. I did a paper once as a grad student. The paper I talked about, actually, where that came out of having a hung around after a talk and a senior scholar coming up and chatting, and we had a discussant who was super combative, who attacked our paper in particular, and that was terrifying. And I can't say I have the precise answer for that, but I know I was very prepared for the presentation, and I had a sense that that this scholar might have a thing or two to say. So I had a couple of lines kind of about how I might respond, right? But I would treat it as a wonderful opportunity to engage with that person, and some of the questions that you're asking that are connected to the questions that they've asked, right? But that part of intimidation is probably going to be there, regardless. But what you'll often find is you might be intimidated because you've been amazed by someone's work, and then when you meet people, they're just more humans, right? There's just there are people who are not very nice around the place, right? But generally, most scholars scholars in general are awkward. Lots of sociologists are very awkward, but people generally really appreciate the fact that someone has taken their work seriously, and if they're engaging it, even if they're engaging it critically, like, that's a positive thing for a scholar, right? To have their, most papers that are written by academics kind of languish largely unread, right? So the fact that someone's work is read and respected and engaged with is most scholars, I would like to think, are delighted to engage with people coming up in the field, in their respective fields, who are willing to engage.
Thank you. Um, how do grad students prepare for roundtable presentations? How is preparation for these similar or different to other presentations?
Cool, that's good. A very good question. So roundtables have a slightly different feel generally. I mean, they vary. Different associations, organizations do them slightly differently, but they tend to feel more informal. They have that beautiful social shape of a circle. They're round, so they're generally better. So they have a much more egalitarian sort of a feel. There isn't that sort of monological transmission of knowledge from the top down that we kind of have built all our classrooms to look like, and that we build conference halls and theatres to look like. So they have a sort of a more democratic, egalitarian kind of a feel. And so, I would say the presentation, I would treat it, if you wish, treat it as if it's a conference presentation in the way that we've talked about today. But you can also use it as an opportunity for sort of more exploratory sort of thinking out loud kind of work. You still want to prepare, right? You can certainly do it as a regular presentation, but often you could do a roundtable presentation. I'm not saying don't prepare as much, but it can be for ideas that are sort of information, right? That you're kind of soliciting feedback on some ideas you're having, some preliminary sort of research that you've done. So they're similar in many respects, but they're different. That there's a feeling of informality. The nice thing about roundtables too is that they can be kind of a gateway drug, right? Get yourself onto a roundtable if you're not yet prepared to go the full hog and do a presentation in front of an audience, right? I know, like a regular style presentation. But also at roundtables, it can be quite, one nice thing that can happen is that randomly a senior scholar happens to be there, happens to sit at the table, and people's guards are down a little bit more, right? There's a more social feel immediately at a roundtable presentation among the audience and between the audience and the presenter, right? Because you're literally sitting next to somebody who's the audience, right? The person on your right is an audience member, and you're talking to them, right? So it's that kind of informality, that slightly more informal sort of a feel, I think makes it a little less nerve-wracking, can make it less nerve-wracking. But there's no replacement, or there's nothing better than preparing, right? Than having you can still have your script and you might go off script, but it's good to have still to prepare.
Thank you. Okay, and then another question sort of related to presentation style. How do you suggest coordinating presentations if there are multiple presenters on the same paper?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a hard one, right? So I've done co-authored presentations a few times, and I'm going to say the same thing. It's about preparation, but it's about a very clear division of presentation, right? It's a very clear division of labor on the presentation. So sometimes people will like to do, so sometimes say a faculty and student co-authored paper, the student might do the whole presentation, right, or vice versa. But it can be an opportunity for the student to present work that sort of has been that a faculty member has sort of vetted and has been part of, let's say, right. Sometimes you see there's a real art to coordinating a presentation with somebody to go back and forth, and you see people do them. When they're done well, they're amazing, right? They're seamless. I think they take a little more practice. You can't just say, okay, by email, okay, I'll do slides 2 to 5, the first 2 pages, you do those 2. You need to kind of work on your segues and your sort of how do you play off, how do you move from one to the other. And that is, obviously you want it to be somebody you have a good working relationship with, and that it's okay too for one person to present a paper that's written by 2, 3, 4, 5 people. And it's nice if the other people in the audience, they can address, if somebody did somebody did the interviews and somebody else coded them, right? The person who did the interviews might be in the audience and might answer some questions that come up in the Q&A, right? So there's no magic formula, but definitely preparing and like a very clear division of labor and knowing when you're going to change off. It's very easy to run out of time. I have seen presentations where it's 2 or 3 presenters to get on a co-authored paper, and one of the presenters, often a more senior person, goes on for too long, and they eat into the time of the person who's a first timer, and they're just chomping at the bit, sitting in the background, waiting to talk about the 2 slides that they've agonized over. So I think it's important to kind of coordinate on that.
Okay, so preparation.
Preparation. Sorry, I mean your own language. Coordinate. Prepare. But yeah, very clear division, like knowing when to trade off. Yeah, and then if somebody is going, it's okay. Well, thanks, Joe. I think we need to move on to the results section. Right. It's okay to intervene. Right.
Awesome. Okay.
That's part of a good working relation, right?
So then, turning to networking, you have a question. I've been asked in the past for my card and I don't have one. Should grad students make business cards or contact cards?
Good question. The card is kind of disappearing, I guess, right? It's funny. I think there are disciplines and types of conferences where those circulate a lot more. I know we had some offer when I was in grad school that we could get them made really cheap. So I had them. You get them in a box of 100 or 200 or 500. I probably used 3 or 4 of them. I got them again when I started the current job, and same kind of thing. I think I didn't use many of them, but they're pretty cheap. You don't have to have one. I mean, most people can make contact very easily because we're all carrying around devices with us generally that make it quite easy to immediately connect with somebody, right, and to exchange emails immediately. I wouldn't say there's a hard and fast rule, but if you have a design sensibility, if you'd like to have one, by all means. But I wouldn't say it's an absolute necessity at sociology conferences. I don't think. I find that international conferences tends to happen a lot more. Right, scholars from certain parts of the world have I don't notice a lot of exchanging of cards happening at CSA, for example, but at the ISA, I've certainly noticed, or I've been at conferences where, it's a lot of Japanese, Chinese scholars in particular seem to often have cards, right? Different parts of the world, there are sort of more, and in different disciplines, I guess there are more kind of norms around carrying cards. But I don't think it's currently something that sociologists do a lot of.
Okay, thank you. And then
I don't think I've given a definitive answer. I wish. I don't think I've given a definitive answer on anything, have I? But anyway.
But it's good. You're giving context. Display the pros and cons. So I have one last question related to networking that we received in advance.
Yeah.
And you did touch on this a bit. So I guess, how important are the formal parts of conferences for networking versus informal? And you mentioned something like research clusters, and I thought maybe you could speak a bit more about that.
So I mean, formal opportunities, I guess. I mean, like things like I can't remember what we call this kind of speed dating thing. I wish.
There's like the speed meeting, yeah.
Speed meeting, yes, sorry, right. So so that's, I mean, I guess it's formal in the sense that it's set up and organized by the association, but really how it rolls out is very informal, right? It's people are just chatting and sharing. Hey, what do you do? Right? There's probably it's kind of rote questions people are asking one another probably, but like a really good way just to get a sense of, or just to develop networks is, the research clusters that have sort of emerged in the CSA over the last few years have been really great, right? You get a sense of, people show up, you're like, oh, that's the person that wrote that paper. Or, oh, hey, I've heard that person is working on this issue, and they might be there, right? The meetings themselves, they vary radically from cluster to cluster, I think, but they're an opportunity for a kind of a formal type of networking, I guess, that ends up kind of then bleed into being semi-formal, informal, if you like. I think in my own experience, the best way that kind of in a really instrumental kind of sense, or in a kind of a career advancement sense, the best way that networks were developed, networks opened up to me was when somebody more senior than me, an advisor, or somebody I'm a grad student and they've just got a job somewhere, where they introduce somebody, right? I think that generally, we know that from studies of social networks kind of stuff, strength and weak ties and that, right? That tends to have positive outcomes in a kind of instrumental sense. In the more informal sort of stuff, just in general, feeling yourself to be part of a more general community, I think lots of the sort of the banquets kind of semi-formal, but the sort of meet and greets that happen within clusters, or ASA has a whole network of a whole range of sorts of different departments host receptions and things like that, right? We usually have the host department host a reception. Going to those sorts of things, right there, it's got free food usually. So the standing around part, often you just it ends up in kind of casual and easy conversation with people that sometimes leads to can lead to a kind of a longer term collegial relationship with somebody, or a friendship, right? In terms of where to, if I was there's no golden rule around where to focus your energy, but if you're making the time investment and the financial investment, right, whether or not it's funded, of going to a conference, like, it's better to involve yourself in more of it than less of it, right? To go to more of the formal and informal events than less, right? I know certainly as a grad student, if I had an opportunity to go to an international conference, I would try and just attend things that brought me out of my comfort zone a little bit, right? Attend receptions and things. Sometimes you go in, you go, oh my God, this is terrifying, I'm out of here, back to your hostel or whatever, right? And mope back, eat on your own or whatever, right? But generally, it's people at sociology conferences in general are positive, collegial, friendly, right? Not always like the top scholars, many of them are, but most people are friendly and are interested in chit chat, right? Like, all those receptions are super awkward, right? They're kind of awkward for everyone except people who everyone knows, or who are real kind of people about town sort of, right? They're very awkward. They really are awkward, right? So your best kind of bet, like, there's no kind of non-loaded term for it, like kind of wingman sort of, right? Like having someone, a grad school colleague or peer with you, or faculty member from your department, right? If you recognize someone in the room who you already know, it's good to even just hang out with them, and then casually kind of conversations can kind of happen, right? So I'm asking, answering the specificity of that. There's something more specific in that question that I'm not touching on though.
No, I think you covered it. Yeah. And we actually just received one more question. I don't necessarily know if you have the answer, but because you're involved with the social theory research cluster, I'm going to ask it. So the person's asking, how do the research clusters in the CSA function? What can I expect if I join one? How can we get the most out of these clusters?
So I guess this is sort of a little off topic, I guess, but it's connected to the conference experience, I guess. So so within the CSA, there was sort of conversations several years ago about should we go the sort of ASA sort of ISA kind of very formally organized, distinctive clusters that would be kind of, or whatever they're called in the ASA. I'm forgetting. Research. What are they called in the ASA? Sections, right? Yeah. And we kind of decided at that time, or I think I was on the exec for a little bit, and then at that time, and it was sort of like, well, let's let them kind of emerge organically and see what areas of interest people have. So to join a research cluster, you just say, hey, I want to join the research cluster. You can email. There are kind of cluster chairs. You email most of the clusters. Many of them, at least, I think, have email lists that are of various levels of activity on those email lists, and by virtue of being a member of the CSA, you can kind of join any of the research clusters. So, and then in terms of this, or the second part of the question was,
what can I expect if I join one? How do you get the most out of it?
Yeah, so really, then what's kind of happened, the kind of structure that's sort of emerged within our sort of within the CSA's our annual meetings is that they're kind of there's sort of streams, I guess, if you like, right? So if I'm sort of involved in the theory ones a bit, and the so Sherry goes, and the program committee goes to great lengths to try and to organize it so that like the 4 theory ones, let's say, are all in a row, preferable in the same room, right? Or they're all on the same day, or they're kind of clustered together in time and space, so that people can have sustained interactions with one another in those spaces, and that's good. It also means that you might end up not running into other people as much from other clusters and stuff, but I think it's been a positive for people developing a kind of a sense of being part of a cohesive kind of subfield within the discipline, and there being kind of conversations happening in those. So I mean, you can it's kind of low hanging fruit. Like there's no great expectation, but if you go to the research cluster meetings when they happen, kind of the annual meeting, each cluster has to have an annual meeting as kind of part of the agreement, part of the association support. So at those, you get a sense of who's involved, and I get a sense with many of the clusters, there's ample opportunities for involvement in various kinds of ways. Right, clusters need chairs. They need clusters collaborate in different sorts of ways around how to organize sessions that might fall under their purview. They propose sessions. They propose panels, right? Like pre-populated panels, right, of maybe more prominent people in a field or some particular issue that's hot in the discipline or in current affairs. So it's there's relatively low barriers to entry, I would say, in being involved in the research clusters, and it's a good way for you to get a sense of who else is working in the fields that are of interest to you. So.
Great, thank you. So thank you everyone for attending, and thank you Mervyn for your presentation, for answering all of our questions. A recording of the webinar will be posted online on the Students at CSA page, and audience members will also be receiving a feedback survey from us, so we'd appreciate if you could fill that out. And before you go, we would also like to let everyone know that we're going to have some additional webinars scheduled for May and June, and we'll be sending everyone on our mailing list some more information about those soon. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and yeah, enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.